today's topic, so home composting basics. I do want to just point out these images that we have here. This is actually food scrap art that was done by a couple folks in my community, Paul and Winsong Kervik. And it's one of the ways that the art community in Vermont is trying to sort of counter the compost or food scraps is icky or gross sentiment. So beautiful images of art here. So why are we, even having this, I guess there's been this push to do more food scrap composting and keeping our food scraps out of the landfill. And I just want to talk for just a quick minute about why that is, to give some context for this. So this slide is from 2015, and it shows that nationally about more than half of what we throw out could actually be better managed or managed in a way that doesn't have as many negative impacts. So about 21% here are food scraps. Another 23% is paper, cardboard, or yard trimmings, and then there's even some more wood waste in here. And all of these, when we don't pay attention to how we manage these, think of them as waste instead of resources, they end up in landfills and incinerators, and can cause some pretty significant human and environmental health concerns, including really exacerbating climate change with all of the greenhouse gas emissions that come from managing these in an anaerobic condition within landfills, or burning them and having some of that then contribute to air pollution. To put this in perspective for folks, I like to show this picture. This is the Rose Bowl in California. It's 90,000 seats, and this is also the data is a little bit dated, but in 2018 they were estimating that the US was producing enough food scraps that were being landfilled to fill this arena once over, every single day. And data since then actually shows that we're going in the wrong direction, that some sources report that it could be as much as twice a day. And so just to get like sort of a visual of how much, as collectively as a nation, we're landfilling, and the impact that if we each do our part, we could have really a significant impact, positive impact on the environmental effects of managing these resources as wastes. I like to also just sort of frame this conversation with the hierarchy to reduce food waste. This is from the Institute for Local Self-Reliances. It's sort of their take on the EPA's food recovery hierarchy. And here, today we're really going to be focusing on the top tiers. We're going to be focusing on home composting, but source reduction. So how can we limit the waste that we're producing to begin with? How can we get edible food into our charitable food system to feed our hungry neighbors? And then today's topic is, of course, home composting. There are a lot of advantages to keeping it local. So home and/or community composting, it better addresses contaminants. When you're actually putting something in your own home compost bin, you're less likely to put in, plastics or glass or metal, those twist ties. So that is something that we want to keep out. Those non-compostable materials are something we want to keep out of our systems. There's a much lower carbon footprint with local management, right? Instead of putting it in, either having a hauler come and truck it around to some other facility, or putting it in your car and taking it somewhere, you're just managing it right in your own space. It really is, in the long term, the least cost option. Even some micro haulers now are less costly than other ways that we might choose to manage our home scraps. But for home composting, while there may be some startup costs, like getting a bin or a system in place, and maybe some time costs in terms of learning how to do it. Programs like the one you're taking part in today are offering at cost or free, low cost or free systems and compost bins, and really trying to address that barrier to make this as accessible as possible. There's also a huge range of compost systems, which we'll be looking at in just a minute. And so depending on your space and how many people are in your household and what your goals are for composting, you can really choose a system that is going to work for you. And that's one of the things that I think is great about this local scale composting. And then it produces compost for folks to use in your own gardens. And so it might be slower to do it to get finished compost in a home setting, but once you get going, you will have, after the first year or two, you will have consistent compost that you can use in your own gardens or yard or plants. And so those are all benefits for keeping it local. The different food scrap diversion options, and I know this varies state by state and community by community, but there are a growing number of collection sites that folks can drop off stuff, their food scraps at. You can hire a hauler, and if you do this, I always recommend that folks get curious and ask where their haulers are bringing it, right? That's an important piece of it. There are a growing number of community composting sites at community gardens and co-housing places and libraries and all over. And so that's another thing that you can look for. And then, of course, you can compost at home, which is what we'll be discussing more in depth today. So the advantages of home composting is you meet your own goals for diversion. You have total control over the process, and it's really convenient. You can compost on your own schedule. And so if you go on vacation for 2 weeks, you don't have to worry about, a hauler coming, paying for a hauler to come if you're not there producing food scraps for them to pick up, or you don't have to stop that service. It's some people find it's an advantage to compost at home over even doing a community composting site, because you don't have to, if you're a volunteer there and you want to leave, you don't have to let folks know or find someone to cover you. And so there's a lot of advantages to just the convenience of composting right in your own space. Challenges are the time. It doesn't have to take a lot of time, but that's something that we hear a lot. People think like, oh, it's going to take so much time for me to do this well. And once you learn a few tricks, it really doesn't. Space can be a challenge for some folks, and then knowledge. And so again, programs like this are trying to address these challenges and break down some of those obstacles or perceived obstacles.
Natasha, can you hear me really quick?
Yes.
It sounds like your microphone's going a bit in and out.
Oh, okay. I'm going to stop.
You sound great right now, but
okay.
You were a bit scratchy and quiet before.
Okay. Is that better?
That sounds great.
Still good? Okay, I'm going to keep, sometimes the bandwidth, there's an issue with the camera on. So for Q&A, I can maybe stop sharing my screen and turn my camera back on so we can have conversation. But just flag me down if that happens again.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So getting into some of the composting basics, which is really all you need at the smaller scale. Composting is a controlled aerobic biological process. And so that means that there needs to be air in the system. That's all aerobic means. And so often if things get really wet and there's not enough air in the system, that's when they can get really stinky. So just remembering that you need it to be sort of fluffy and have pore spaces, air spaces in with the material can address some of the potential odor concerns right off the bat. The biological process piece refers to all these great critters here in this picture that are the superstars. So the microorganisms are really the ones who are doing the hard work in your compost system, as long as you are creating the right habitat for them to thrive. And then the primary end products are really just a little bit of carbon dioxide, water, and of course our finished compost. So how do we keep these microbes happy? And I find sometimes it's helpful to think of them like pets. So, right, so they need carbon and nitrogen or brown materials and green materials. That's basically food for them and gives them energy to keep doing their jobs. Sometimes it can be helpful to put in a little initial boost, like a little healthy soil or even finished compost or some kind of manures. That's not really required. But some people like to sort of inoculate or start, add in some microorganisms to start with. And then there's this moisture air ratio, right? They do need water, just like you and I need water, like your dogs and cats need water. But just like us, they also need air. And so if you can visualize, like if you wet a sponge down and squeeze it out really well, but it's still damp, that's about the moisture level that you want for your compost material. And then keeping it small is helpful because these are tiny little microorganisms, right? And so this has to do with creating more surface that they can attach to and start breaking down these materials. And so you might consider, instead of tossing a whole pumpkin into your compost bin, chopping it up into a couple pieces. If you're going to use leaves and you can mow over the leaves, or especially some mowers have that bag that can collect them, mow over it, and that just helps give more space. And you can, of course, do some grinding, chipping, or shredding. Like paper is fine as a carbon source, but you want to shred it. You don't want just like a ream of whole paper in your system. So you want to have your carbon pieces and your brown pieces and your green pieces, so those food scraps, small enough that they can really mix together. So there is some carbon and nitrogen and a little bit of moisture wherever those materials are in your pile. So here's some of the different home systems that I've used or that I've seen. There's no way that I could put them all up here because there are literally hundreds now on the market. I have 3 different sort of types of tumbler systems. They're do-it-yourself tumbler systems. If you just do a quick Google search, you can figure out how to do that, or these are purchased ones, of course. I do prefer the tumblers that have 2 chambers, like this metal one, or even this little plastic one, sort of rigid plastic one, because what that lets you do is fill up one side. And then once this is full, you can start on the next side. And then by the time the second side is full, this one is pretty well decomposed. And we'll talk about sort of management in a minute, but these are just some different system styles and things to keep in mind. And then of course there's bins like this. This is an open bin, but it has this hardware cloth on it to keep your material in and your critters out, and a lid. And then, there are a lot of bins like this. They're just sort of the plastic bins that you can choose if that's useful to you. And then often you'll see folks have 2 different types. This might be for carbon storage, or it might be that one is for once the material is initially broken down and doesn't really look like food scraps anymore, it's not totally finished, but you can empty it into another bin to keep using that space in your tumbler if you're using that variety of system. So where your system, that's an important consideration. Year-round access is something that we think about here in the Northeast. We get snow and ice sometimes, I guess not every year, but typically there's some winter considerations. So you want to, oops, are things okay? All right. You want to be sure that you can access it because you're going to be eating and having food scraps that you need to manage year-round. And I'll just share what I do. We have just a bin system because it's just 2 of us in our household. It's not a whole lot of volume. And in the winter, I just put my snowshoes on and I make a path and I keep making a path, and that works for me. But just think about that a little bit, that you're going to need to, shovel or plow or have some sort of access to wherever you want to have your systems, or maybe you have it somewhere where it's covered and that's less of an issue. You want to look at the ground surface and slope. So you want to be sure that, you know, it's going to be harder to get these systems well situated if it's a really steep slope. And then you may also have issues with stuff sort of running, either, you know, liquids running off or even material running out if you don't have all sides of that bin on solid ground. And so those are just some things to keep up in mind. Sun or shady sites or some combination is totally fine. I get the question a lot from homeowners or community members that they think that sun is what makes hot compost. It's actually the activity of the microbes that are heating things up if you get some heat in your compost. And so sun or shade is perfectly fine. An accessible and convenient location is more important than what kind of sun exposure it has. You can also consider things like protection from the weather. Like I just mentioned, maybe you want an overhang so you don't have to worry about shoveling. Some folks have little greenhouses or hoop houses. If you have the space in them, you can certainly put your compost system inside one of those outdoor structures. Some people move them into a garage. There's just some carbon issues that I would recommend if it's really in a semi-enclosed or in fully enclosed space. And then you want, of course, proximity to whatever your carbon is. And that, again, those are the browns, so wood shavings or leaves. And so maybe, you know, here in this picture, this is a bin, just a trash bin that has wood shavings in it and a bungee cord to make sure that if wind knocks this over, the lid doesn't come off and it doesn't roll around. And then you lose your nice dry carbon. So is there somewhere that you can have an additional storage, or is it just outside your garage and so you can have your carbon inside somewhere? And then if you do have some tools that you're going to be using, if it's occasional, proximity isn't that big of a concern, but it's just something to think about depending on what your goals are. So really, I recommend for home composting or backyard composting, the simple and slow method. In bins, this really means following the basic recipe of 1 green to 3 browns, and that's by volume. So if you can see in this slide, this little home bucket, this kitchen caddy is what they're called, things that you collect food scraps in inside your home. If you're emptying this out and it's full and you're using carbon or browns like leaves, dried leaves, or shredded paper, you're going to want about 2 to 3 of this same volume when you add that. And so and we'll talk about how to add that in the next slide. But so you just basically put your food scraps in and then you add your carbon and you just keep doing that until your bin is full. You can turn it occasionally if you want to, but you actually really don't have to. It's just going to be slower. So compost will be ready in a year to a year and a half with this method. What does happen sometimes is that people find, like in the previous slide, you might want 2 bins because at some point this will fill up. And there is decomposing that's happening, which reduces the volume that's in your bin. So you might be surprised that it feels full. And then like 2 weeks later, gosh, there's room, you can keep adding. It's fine to just keep adding to that. Your finished compost is going to be more towards the bottom, but as that volume shrinks inside your system, you can just keep topping it off for the backyard systems. It is good to think about having some kind of twigs or branchier stuff, or if you're a gardener, think like sunflower stalks or, you know, something or whatever kind of flower stalks, something woodier that you can kind of crisscross at the end. And that helps with that air situation that I talked about at the beginning. So that'll make sure that things don't get too dense at the bottom and there can still be airflow coming in. And then you layer your nitrogen, so your food scraps, and then some kind of carbon, and then more nitrogen and more carbon, and you kind of go like that. And to see what this might look like in practice, this is actually what we call, like in a bin system, or even in a pile like this one on the right. You want to build a nest. Some people call this the bathtub method as well. You might have heard of that. So you really, at the home level where you're not looking for speed, it's fine to have more carbon, right? So you want to build this nice fat, like a bird's nest is what I think of it as, with lots of nice fluffy carbon on the bottom. And then every time you add your food scraps, you top that with a little bit more carbon. And as this builds, you add more carbon around the edges and you build it up like that. And here are just some other images or photos. This one clearly was in the winter, and Kat was just adding some wood shavings on top after she built her initial hay bale kind of nest. Compost tumblers are a little bit different, so I do like to touch on that management in case any of you choose to do a tumbler system. You really, like I said before, you want to start by filling, if you have a 2-chamber system. If not, that's fine. But if you have a 2-chamber system, you want to start by filling up one completely before you start on the next. We do recommend that you use something that has a lot of carbon in it. Comparatively, wood shavings have like 300 or 400 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And to put that in perspective, dried leaves have like maybe 50 or 60 parts. So there's almost 4 times the amount of carbon in something like wood shavings. And what this does, especially for tumbler systems that are enclosed, and there's some advantages to that, and often they're up off the ground, and there are advantages to that too. But using something that's so high in carbon, you actually don't need to follow that 3 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen recipe. You can use maybe half the volume of carbon, or maybe 1 to 1. And so because there's so much more carbon in those wood shavings, and what that does effectively is it allows you to really maximize the volume in this tumbler system for your food scrap management. So once the second chamber is full, if you peek back at the first one, you'll see that maybe it's only half full now because so much decomposition has happened. Likely you won't be able to really recognize food scraps at that point in that first chamber that's been in there for a while. And it won't have that same smell of fresh food scraps to it. And so at that point, you can either, if you feel like they're not really smelly, and you might see some eggshells or avocado pits or avocado skins, some tougher stuff like that. But if by and large, it's starting to look a little bit more like dirt and less like food scraps, you can either just add more to that and then go back and forth. But at some point, you need to empty the tumbler. And so at that point, you can safely empty it into a pile on the ground. It shouldn't be attractive to animals. We do recommend that you put a tarp or cover it in some way at that point and not just leave it open. But a lot of people will use one of those black sort of soil saver type bins and with a tumbler, and they put that the already first, mostly I won't say mostly composted, but initially composted material from the tumbler into a bin right next to the tumbler, and they just keep filling it up. And then at some point, that'll be really great compost for you to use. So the point that's especially important, and we are going to talk about some animal concerns, but the point that I really want to make sure you all hear clearly is, regardless of what kind of carbon you're using, you really want to make sure that you're using enough of it. Carbon material not only feeds your microbes doing the composting work, but it also acts as a biofilter. And what that means is that it's really good at absorbing odors and absorbing any excess moisture. And so if you have enough carbon, you won't have smelly, stinky compost. And so a compost system. And so that's really important. And then just to remember that different materials have different amounts of carbon, so different volumes might be needed. And you can start with the guidelines that I gave you, that I just gave you, that either 3-to-1 or maybe 1-to-1, depending on your system. You can experiment with it, but there's a lot of online resources as well. And so if you are having any issues and you don't think you're doing it quite right, you can reach out. But certainly if you go to put your fresh food scraps in and you open the lid or you open that chamber door for your tumbler and it smells really bad, you need more carbon, most likely, or it's too wet. And the advantage of keeping carbon dry is that it can help manage that moisture from the food scraps as well. And so strictly speaking, you don't have to keep your carbon dry. I mean, it'll still have the carbon in it, but to get that right moisture to air ratio, it's very helpful to have dry carbon sources on hand. If pets or wildlife become an issue, and I try to put in the pets too, because people forget that dogs will really like fresh food scraps potentially. It's important again to have adequate carbon, and that you're just going to keep hearing everybody say that who works with composting systems, especially home systems. You always want to keep those food scraps covered with carbon or soil. If there is a problem, or if some people during, you know, like when bears are coming out of hibernation, they go overboard with the carbon. That'll slow the composting process down a little bit, but at that point, it's much more important to make sure that there's no yummy smelling odors coming that will attract animals into your system. You can also use hardware cloth, which is just a metal mesh, but like the 1/8 inch screen, basically, to keep things like rodents out of your system. And depending on your system and where you have it sited, it is nice to have that underneath the system. And if you're using like maybe a pallet bin system, so using pallets that have those gaps in between the slats, the wood slats, line that with that wire mesh to make sure that your material stays in and the animals stay out. And then some folks do decide that they just feel more comfortable if they have an enclosure around it as an extra deterrent. I will just let you all know that I live in the foothills of the Green Mountains on the western side in Vermont, and we absolutely have bear. We're surrounded by a few hundred acres of woods. At the end of a dead-end dirt road, we see signs of bear. I've been here for 17 years and have never once had a bear get into my compost. So it really can be done. You just need to pay attention to the odors. We talked about winter composting already a little bit. So access to your composter is really key. Sometimes, especially if you're using primarily like leaves, dried leaves, fall is a great time to be keeping, you know, bags or bins of leaves around. So really stock up on whatever kind of brown material you're using, so you have plenty of it to take you through the winter, because once all the snow's on the ground, it's going to be a lot harder to get those materials. I will say that if you're in a pinch, or if you're using a tumbler system and you want to go the wood shavings route, you can often ask neighbors or folks in your community if they have like guinea pig bedding or rabbit hutches. That material, even with the manure, is totally great to use. You can also buy a compressed bale of wood shavings at most farm and garden stores for like $5, maybe $6 a bale. And that is enough for a backyard compost system, likely for more than a year. So if you're going to invest in some kind of, if you actually feel like you might purchase some kind of material to add into your compost system, that is the biggest bang for your buck that you can get. It's super high carbon. It's all curly and has a lot of surface area. It's great at absorbing moisture and odors. And so I think it's a $5 or $6 well invested for the backyard composter. Starting with an empty bin or tumbler can be helpful. Things slow down even more slow in the winter when everything is cold. You likely don't have the volume or the mass of material for those microbes to stay as active as they are when they're not in freezing temperatures. And so, you know, emptying out, making sure that at least one, if not both of the chambers of your tumbler is empty at the start, or making sure that maybe you have a second bin and you're going to start with an empty bin for the winter and into the spring. That can be really helpful. There will still be some drying and freezing, and so you might lose a little bit of volume in your system, but not a whole lot. I just wanted to point out that, you know, there is some insulation on tumblers, and I've seen all kinds of crazy things, like people wrapping their bin system. It really comes down to the volume that's in these systems, and it's really hard, even with these extra protections, that if it's a small volume and we have a cold winter, it's likely gonna freeze. It doesn't hurt to have these things, but for smaller volumes, I don't know that it really makes that big of a difference in the freezing situation. It might a few degrees on either end, but when we're in the dead of winter, it's not really going to keep your system from freezing. I also like to just highlight that if we get you know, one of those crazy sort of midwinter thaws, it used to be the January thaw, but we've been getting them in December and February lately, where it hits 70 or 80 degrees in the middle of the winter, or in the spring when things are really starting to thaw, your compost can become kind of mushy. Think of it as like mud season for your food scraps. And sometimes with that extra moisture, like I was saying, if things are too wet, they can get smelly as it thaws. So the key there is to just know that that might be the time that you want to add extra carbon. And you don't even necessarily need to flip it, but stick a pitchfork or a shovel in, or some kind of way. With a tumbler, you can just spin it, but with a bin system, and just try to get carbon, you know, create pockets where you can get dry carbon down in there. So it can help absorb some of that moisture and make some airspace, and try to get things back on track for the next season. So I'd like to end with sort of thinking about that you get to use your compost, which many of us buy compost. And so wouldn't it be great if you could actually utilize the compost that you're making from your own food scraps? Not all compost, just when it sort of looks a little bit closer to dirt, doesn't necessarily mean that it is ready for use in your garden. It can actually burn some plants or cause some, you know, attract animals if it's not actually done. So mature compost should smell earthy. You should have really no qualms about sticking your hands right in there and grabbing up a big handful. So nothing kind of icky or questionable in there. It doesn't reheat, or doesn't sort of, the composting process doesn't activate again if you turn it and aerate it, or make sure that it has the right moisture. There should be, aside from eggshells and the occasional mango or avocado pit, which is fine, those are woodier and take longer. There should really be no other identifiable ingredients. And it essentially just looks like dark soil. Unfinished soil, if you put a handful of your, compost, I'm sorry, if you put a handful of your compost in a Ziploc bag or a jar, make sure it's a little bit moist, and leave it for 3 days. And then after 3 days, open it with your nose right there and smell it. And if it smells a little sour, that means there's still some kind of brown ingredient, some kind of carbon that isn't finished composting. If it smells like ammonia, it means that there's likely food scraps, some kind of nitrogen that isn't finished composting. So that's something that's really easy to do. It might take a little while to train your nose to smell it. And just have your nose right over the jar or the bag when you open it, because it's going to dissipate pretty quickly. But that is one easy way any of us can start to identify whether it needs a little bit more time to finish or whether it's ready for use. And that is my presentation. I'll just say that there's a whole lot more materials available on the Composting Association of Vermont's website under projects. If you're using the drop-down menu, it's community composting, or you can just go to compostingvermont.org/community-composting. And there's all kinds of tip sheets for different systems and for winter composting and for recipe if you want to learn more. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and we can see if anybody has questions.
So Natasha, can you hear me, Natasha?
Yeah.
Okay, so what we thought we might do at Olivia's suggestion was to split the group up and have our online guests join you in the Q&A, and then have half the group go outside for the demo and then switch. So maybe about 30 minutes for each component. Does that sound okay?
Sure. Yeah, I wasn't sure if that was still the plan because it sounded like some folks did the demo already, but however works on your end is fine with me.
Okay, that's probably what we'll do, because we really just got to introductions out there and didn't get to the demo until while the tech was so ably being restored. So thank you again to Amber or Allison's suggestion. So why don't we have this side of the room can join me outside, and for our online guests, Majestic is going to record the demo. And then she'll send that to the online folks so that you can have a sense of what that's all about. And the folks that are online and the other side of the room will stay with Natasha. We'll see you back here in about 30 minutes.
1 second, Natasha.
Sure.
Sure.
Natasha, just because we have the microphone, Adam's going to feed audience questions to you as they come.
Great.
Thank you.
So Natasha, you can control all the attendees, right? That's you're a presenter to. Okay, I'll leave that up to you. I don't know if there's anyone online that has questions or anyone.
And I can also read chat. So if folks put questions in chat, I can also, you can read them or I can read them as well. I can see those.
Anyone in the room have a question?
My question is mostly about ground materials, because it sounds like you need a lot of them. And I got the part about the shade bale, but what if you want to use leaves? Like how many do you need? Do you need to shred them? That's the scary part to me from what I heard with all that ground stuff.
Could you hear that, Natasha, or do you need me to relay?
If you can repeat it, that I heard most of it, but maybe not all the details.
Yep. So the question is regarding the browns, the leaves. So how many do you need to get through a season? How it needs to be treated, shredded, just sort of maybe go more in depth to how to utilize those.
Yeah, so the volume question, how many question is a little bit hard because that's gonna vary depending on how much food scraps your household produces, because it's a ratio thing, right? So it's about 1 part, if you're using primarily leaves, it's about 1 part food scraps to 2 to 3 parts leaves. And so if you're a household of 1 or 2 and you don't eat a whole lot of vegetables or other things that you might be putting in your compost, then you know, fruits and veggies primarily, then you won't need a whole lot. But if you are either an avid veggie eater or have a larger household and you're consuming this, the amount of food scraps that you're going to be managing is going to be different. And so just keep that in mind. If you want to give me a for instance, you're welcome to, but if you just think of that kitchen caddy, and do you have kitchen caddies there, I think, that you're giving away today?
Yep, there's some on the
so you
stage,
can
I
have
think.
a visual, just for folks to have a visual, right? If you have one there, or if you know what they are, then you can think like, I'd probably fill this up once a week, 3 times a week, once every 2 weeks. You don't have to wait for it to be full, of course, to, something like that. So you don't have to wait for it to be full to empty it. If it takes you 2 to 3 weeks to fill that container up. You probably don't want that in your house for that whole time. Depends a little bit on what you put in there. And so that's your cue for that. And as well, depending on, again, where you live and how many trees you have that lose their leaves, you might be able to easily get enough from your own yard, but you might also be asking, some folks live in places where they have leaf pickup. And so they, they'll actually go and say to their neighbors, you're not using those. Can I have those? And often they're already bagged anyway, and it's nice and easy to store those. I like to mention the wood shavings, again, because that's like your emergency carbon. And it's pretty affordable. Or you can even, like I gave some examples from like home pets, or as long as it's not treated wood, like some college, high schools or other folks might have like wood shops or woodworkers. And as long as it's not like a treated wood, it's just the fresh wood, they're often looking for ways to get rid of their own shavings from their projects. And so just think about the partners that you might be able to connect with to get those browns.
So Natasha, as far as measuring the browns with sort of the comparison, obviously when it's been shredded up, and that's a much more dense pack in here versus just, light leaves that maybe fill it, but are not really apples to apples to the shredded amount. I mean, so is it 3 to 1 of light leaves or 3 to 1 of shredded dense leaves?
Yeah, and so that's why we often will say like 2 to 3 to 1. It depends a little bit. So if your leaves that you've maybe mowed over are pretty mushed, broken up into smaller pieces, 2 of those volumes are probably just fine. But either way, you want to start with, and sometimes people will even buy like a single hay bale and break it up and use that to make that initial nest, which, should lap up the sides of your system a little bit. And have a nice airy filter on the bottom. And then you're just needing leaves to, to go on top, right? So there are some different ways around that, or maybe you have a neighbor that, has spent hay. It doesn't have to be like high quality hay. Sometimes farmers, if you have farmers nearby that have hay bales, at some point they're just no good anymore for what they're using it for, and you can pick up some of that material for free as well. So talk about it and ask around.
It's like one question came in on the chat.
Yeah, so what type of shredded paper can you use as a brown filler? So we don't recommend glossy papers that have different types of chemicals in them, but most newspaper is fine, even if there's colored ink. It's by and large soy-based ink at this point. But there's really not a huge concern about that. You can even use some cardboard in it, but you want to rip that up. You don't want to just put like whole cardboard boxes in your pile, because that'll take up space and it really won't. Again, that gets to that surface area, right? And shredding up cardboard can be a little bit of a challenge. So newspaper, I also know some folks who do a lot of shredding at home, like they have a shredder. So that white paper again is fine to use. I think a diversity is better if you can, but those are, so not only use paper or only use leaves even, but mixing it up is not required, but you get a more interesting diversity of microorganisms in the final product.
You have to buy worms.
Do you need to buy worms?
No. Worms really don't have a place in outdoor composting systems. The only worms that are really used for composting or worm composting or vermiculture are red wrigglers, and they do not survive outside in the winter here. And so we really don't want to be, there's no need to be introducing worms into your compost system. We don't really have time to talk about those invasive jumping worms or snake worms now, but That's another reason. They're pretty much all over. I can share resources about them. We have tip sheets. I just earlier this week, did a short presentation for the home and community composter and on-farm composter on those invasive worms, or those damaging invasive worms. But so you don't want to be like gathering up worms and adding them to your compost, or certainly buying them. And just a quick side note on the worms, because we live in a glaciated area, all earthworms are actually invasive. We have no native worms in our landscape. And that's true of all glaciated areas. And so just keep that in mind. So, no, go ahead.
Fruit flies, thank you for the tip on how to get rid of them. Is the compost still good if you've been infested with?
Did you hear that?
I didn't.
Do fruit flies contaminate the compost? Is it still good if you get an infestation of them?
That's fine. I don't worry about that. But and especially if you eat a lot of melons or citrus, that can tend to create more fruit fly conditions. They should die down. If they don't, try to be sure that you're getting the carbon right mixed up and close to your food scraps. And then the other tip is to rinse your kitchen collection bucket or kitchen caddy with a vinegar water mix when you're rinsing it. And that also is a natural way to help keep fruit fly populations down. Yeah, and then we also had a question come in about discussing what types of food scraps should be used in composting. And that's a great question. And I can add a slide to that for the future. So really, for the home composter, you want to be avoiding putting meat and grease and larger amounts of dairy into your system, because there may be some different pathogens or things in them that you are not going to be getting the temperatures hot enough to kill those. But I will just say that if you make a lasagna and there's a little meat in it, or if you have noodles that had, some oil, like a pesto that might have a bit of olive oil, like those plate scrapings are fine. We're talking about large volumes of those materials. I've seen, disturbingly, from some larger national nonprofits send out things for composting basics, and they say don't include bread, pasta, rice. There is no reason to not include those materials in your compost system. They will absolutely break down. The idea there is that they might be attracting like dogs or wildlife. I have not found that to be the case, and especially not the case if you're using carbon. I mean, if you throw a loaf of bread out your door and it's just there on the ground, likely someone's going to come and scavenge it, right? But if it's mixed into a system, I really think that that's okay to do. And so my list is pretty short, actually. The other thing I'll say is that if you're a tea drinker, and especially if you're loose tea, of course, is fine, but many tea bags now are actually made with plastic in it. So one, just know that and consider whether you want to be soaking plastic in hot water to drink your tea. Maybe that's fine. It depends on who you are and what your sensitivities are to that topic. But you really, those plastics won't break down in a compost system. And so you may have bits of plastic left. You want to be peeling, if you're purchasing fruit and veggies from a grocery store that uses those fruit labels, PLU stickers, those are also plastic. You want to be peeling those off if possible. But the other things I really don't worry about. I mean, I had one home composter who got a little funky when she basically had an expired jar of mayonnaise and she put the whole jar in her compost. And it was a little gross for a few weeks, but anything, even that you can recover from. Composting by and large is a very forgiving process. And so if something seems a little off, figure out what it is, or ask someone you know who can help you figure it out. And it doesn't ruin things. You can totally recover from that. It might just take a little bit of adjusting to what you're using.
Gary, did you have a question? I saw your hand up.
Well, the weeds and seeds kind of thing. One knows one thing, but crabgrass is another thing. If you're going to be using the product to spread on an area of lawn or you throw it into a garden, does it have to be really terribly hot to kill off the crabgrass seed, or what's the story?
So the question is, any sort of yardweed, crabgrass, that sort of stuff that ends up in there, how do you go about making sure that they don't sprout once you use the compost? Is it about the temperature of it? And just
Yeah,
discuss
so cold compost systems will not kill weed seeds. That's really just the way that is. So there are a couple things that I can suggest to that. So if you're putting something in and you can put it in before it goes to seed, or pop those seed heads off, and just bag those up. And some people put them in plastic bags and leave them out in the sun to try to kill them, or they'll just put the seed heads in a plastic basket and dispose of it with their trash. Those are some ways to keep those things out of your finished compost. A lot of it is going to be hard. Like, you'll even get like tomato or cucumber volunteers from home compost, those seeds, so it's not even just weed seeds, but you may not want pumpkin sprouting in your front garden. Know that that's a possibility. If you feel like you have a potentially weedy end result, it is still great to top dress on your lawn, or fill in holes on your lawn, or divots and seed right over it. That's something you're going to be mowing, and then it's green. I mean, unless you're a purist for your lawn, but I find most people who I connect with aren't. As long as you're mowing it and it won't go to seed again, that's a good way to still use that finished compost to improve your local soil health and get things growing. The other thing that I like to remind folks is that there is a natural seed bank in all soil everywhere. And so sometimes, even if you have really good compost that you've bought, or you've gotten your temperatures up because you have the volume to do that, and you're really sure that there are no weed seeds in there, if you put it on an area in your property or your garden or your yard, and it just creates a nice place for any seeds to germinate. So if you have weed seeds in your yard and you put compost, that could also make just a better environment for those to sprout up. And so not all weed seeds come from compost, but certainly there is the likelihood of that, depending on what you put in it if you're cold composting.
Do grass clippings and leaves need to be dried out, or can you take grass right from your bagger and put it in the compost?
So do grass and grass and leaves rather need to be dried out, or can it go right from the bagger of your lawnmower into the compost?
Yeah, so everything has some carbon and nitrogen in it, right? It's that spectrum, and we talk about it as the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And so drier things that basically the nutrient, the chemical component of those things are slightly different, and there'll be more carbon compared to the nitrogen that's left in those. But it's still a good carbon source. So you can certainly use grass clippings and leaves that are chopped up that are not, you don't have to like dry them. But you'll just have to pay attention to, you might want to opt closer to that 3-to-1 volume as opposed to 2-to-1, because it's proportionally less carbon that you might be getting if it's really fresh stuff. Like fresh green grass clippings are really actually more nitrogen than they are carbon. And so just keep that in mind. But you can use any of that.
One more. Are loose tea leaves, so we have a large volume of loose tea leaves, is that brown or green?
So a large volume of loose tea leaves, are those brown or green?
Yeah, so I put them a little bit towards the brown, but other people I know put them a little bit more, they count it as green. And it's one of those things where it's a proportion, like it's that carbon to nitrogen proportion. I doubt that you would have a large enough volume of dried tea leaves to actually count as all of your carbon. So like mixed in with stuff, it's totally fine to put in there. And if I'm wrong, let me know. But if, unless you have, gallons and gallons of tea leaves, that's likely not going to be your own carbon source. I
Barry,
will,
did you have
just one quick thing. Most coffee filters, those paper coffee filters are still paper. And so those are fine. Paper coffee filters and grounds are totally fine to put into your compost system. I just wanted to highlight that because I was saying that the tea bags weren't.
The coffee question, so that.
Okay. Jerry, did you have something else?
Coffee grounds, I just throw them directly under a tree without even bothering about composting. They just sit on the soil and do the job, I think. But the other question was in New England, with we call winter dripping nose season, there's tons of Kleenex that are going into landfill. Should they be going into compost?
So the question is, with used Kleenex, can they go into the compost?
Yeah, so that is a personal determination for you. And it also, I would say, depends on, are you really sick, and is it really, sort of that is it because you were outside and your nose was running and you blew your nose? I would be more comfortable with that than if you have a lot of green mucus, milky mucus that you're blowing into that Kleenex. I would dispose of that differently. That's my personal boundary. But certainly if you have paper towels that you use to dry your hands or that you use to dry other things, those can go in. Napkins can go in. Less so with Kleenex, but just a note again about paper towels and napkins. Some of those products also now have plastic woven into them to make them more cloth-like. And so just look, know the products that you're buying and what they're made of is what I would recommend there. But for Kleenex, I guess it just depends on what you're comfortable with. I wouldn't take other people's, like, not from outside of your home's Kleenex. But if it's your own home and you're comfortable with it, it will break down. And given the time duration of, even if there were some, bacterial infiltrates on those Kleenex, by the time you're using your compost, those won't be viable anymore. They'll be gone. I'm just a little cautious because with the COVID thing, there are some different recommendations there. And so my answer now is different than it would have been 4 years ago. So
we don't want the next strain of COVID starting at a compost pile on Shaker Street, Jerry. Is that the
very unlikely from my understanding, but I do want to, we need to put human health concerns first. And so that's my caveat.
I'm curious, what would be the timeline for even a COVID tissue in tissue? What's the problem there that the soils are not going to break down? And how are you going to have that with the
so he's asking if you had a contaminated tissue, as far as the timeline of the breaking down, the concern later on, how significant that is, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably more of a disclaimer than anything that, Natasha's not an.
Yeah, I'm not a public health expert, but what I will say is where I would get more concerned is actually if you were actively, so I was emphasizing that you really don't need to turn your home composting system, your backyard composting system. You can just layer it up and it will break down over time. But some homeowners or backyard composters want to engage more, because the more you sort of manage it and mix up your greens and browns and check your moisture, the faster that composting process will happen, because you're basically creating a more ideal environment for those microbes to be as efficient as possible. And so my primary concern with any tissues or potentially virally contaminated materials getting into that is actually not in the finished product, but in the, if there's tissues in there and then 2 days later someone goes in and they're mixing it up with a pitchfork and potentially inhaling it or getting some of that, the material on them, that is a potential vector for transmission if the viruses haven't really died at that point. And so if you're really just putting it in there and covering with browns and leaving it and covering it with more food scraps and browns and just sort of like having that be more of a static system, one that you're not actively managing, my personal comfort level goes up. But I will just say again, I'm not a public health expert, and you will likely get different answers to this question depending on who you ask.
Natasha, is there a resource for folks to check out to figure out which brands of paper towels and napkins may have the plastics, or is it just a matter of trying to find something on the packaging? Or
yeah, it's hard to find it on the packaging. The Center for Environmental Health has a database for those types of products and compostable products like the paper, paper plates and bowls and all of that is paper cups. But they're looking more at PFAS, so those forever chemicals that might be used in those. They haven't added my understanding is that they're working on adding something for microplastics, but they have last time I looked. But PFAS is something we haven't talked about. It is something to think about as well. You don't necessarily want to be putting those products into your compost system because they won't break down. But I will say that for compostable products, everyone is pretty much moving away and have self-regulated and are starting to ban, like for BPI, which is the organization that certifies for compostability of those food, like plates and cups and stuff like that. They will no longer certify if it has added PFAS. Now, PFAS is everywhere. So if you test, there will be some PFAS in it because it's in the raw materials, but some companies were adding it as like a grease barrier. So you'd have this nice fiber, you think it looks like all paper plate, for example, but then if you spray it down with a PFAS type of chemical so that grease from your chicken doesn't go through to your lap at a picnic, that's where it's going to be a problem. So there is a good database out there for that. And those paper plates and cups or bowls, I wouldn't recommend the bioplastics that say they're compostable. Those may break down in hot industrial systems, but not in the backyard. But if you know that there aren't PFAS or microplastic liners, again, to keep things from seeping, if they're truly fiber, I put those in my own backyard system. I think those are also fine in terms of a carbon source. Shredding them up is better than putting a stack of paper plates that you gathered up, because those will sit together and can get anaerobic, too wet in the middle. But those are some other things to think about.
Can she talk a little bit about these countertop
Sure.
compost bins, and do they get smelly? And the fruit fly thing kind of scares me because we already fight them with the bananas and the tomatoes. So how often do people change them? And how do you keep them so they're not gross?
Yep. So she's asking about the kitchen caddy and basically the logistics of it. How frequently are you emptying it? How do you keep fruit flies and things from being a pest and stinky?
Yep. So a couple things there. One, a little bit of apple cider vinegar and water and a few drops of soap in a little dish will attract fruit flies and trap them, and they drown. That's a good way to knock back a population if you have a problem. You can also pretty affordably buy those that's like a little tent for your fruit, that, a little mesh thing that goes over them, and that can also help limit fruit flies from a fruit fly population. So those are some things sort of at the top to reduce the number of flies that you're dealing with. That vinegar wash, that's a white vinegar wash, in your kitchen caddy does a good job of also sort of preventing them from getting in. And the metal ones, some of the plastic kitchen caddies can get little pockets in them, in the plastic over time. And those are harder to clean. And there are little things that can kind of microscopically get stuck in there and cause either odors or potentially, perpetuate fly issues. So the metal or ceramic ones are fine, but the plastic ones are fine too. It just means that you might need to scrub it a little bit more to keep odors or things down. And then you can also make, and I can share, they're really easy instructions to make a newspaper, like liner for your kitchen caddy. You might be folks, at least folks who have kids or nieces and nephews that you connect with might be more familiar about it. It's the newspaper hat. It's basically the same thing, but you invert it, and a single sheet of newspaper, like full-size newspaper, actually makes a hat or a bucket that fits the average kitchen caddy pretty well. And so having something like that might be helpful to, like, everyone has their own little thing that they don't like. Like my thing is, I really don't like when onion skin sticks to the side of my kitchen caddy. I don't know why. That's my personal thing. Other people have their own things. So having some kind of newspaper liner like that, or even some people will just put like a paper towel at the bottom, and that can help absorb some moisture. And when you dump it, that makes sure that everything at the bottom comes out of your kitchen caddy. Those are some tips and tricks. There are these compostable kitchen caddy liners that you can purchase. They're green plastic. They look like green plastic. They're a bioplastic. With that, I would just say buyer beware. There are some that use misleading language and aren't actually compostable, and there are some that are only going to break down in hot composting. If that is the direction that you feel would work best for you and your household, I recommend the BioBag brand. I get no kickbacks. I'm not affiliated with them in any way, but I know for sure and from personal experience that those will break down in a cold compost system. And so it's BIOBAG is the name, and you can order them online, and you can likely find them in a local health food store or maybe grocery store as well, depending on where you live. So those are other ways to sort of keep that ick factor down. In terms of how often you should empty it, I empty mine once a week, unless I'm doing some big, veggie processing project, and then I empty it when it's full. So I guess even if it's not full, I empty it once a week, and otherwise I empty it whenever it's full, if that makes sense.
And it doesn't get smelly?
It doesn't get smelly. I don't think, I mean, sometimes it does if you neglect it. Also depends a little bit on what you put in it and what you think is smelly. Like the banana peels get that sort of like rotten banana-y smell a lot faster than eggshells or coffee grounds. I am a coffee drinker. I put my coffee grounds right in there. I find that actually acts as a little bit of a biofilter because things smell kind of like that coffee as opposed to some other perhaps unsavory smells. But I don't find that it gets very smelly. But again, that's a hard question to answer definitively because it depends on what it is you're eating and putting in there. And also how sensitive you might be. I think some people might argue that a banana peel smells like banana and not like rotten banana, but I find overripe bananas I don't really like that odor personally, even if they're still edible.
Okay, great. It sounds like you had wonderful questions, a wonderful session. We're going to shift and invite the group that stayed behind out to the lobby and have a little demo out there and a Q&A, but I bet you've got a lot of information from Natasha already. So, and then this group can work with Natasha on maybe related questions that you might have. And one that I do have, Natasha, is, can you talk a little bit about, compostable bags for the home composter?
Can you repeat that?
Can you talk a little bit about, the idea of compostable bags going
Yep,
in the
I actually
home?
just mentioned that. So, so I was basically saying for those compostable bags or liners, they come in all sizes, but for like your kitchen caddy or kitchen collection can, whatever you're using, or even slightly larger, depending on how you're collecting food scraps. You really need to pay attention to what it is you're buying. There are some that use misleading language on the packages, like degradable, that will not break down. And there are others that will only break down in a hot compost system, so more of an industrial commercial setting. And I'll just, some folks, if you're still in the room, have heard this but already, but the one brand that I know of for sure breaks down in cold compost systems, like your backyard system, is the Bio Bag brand. And I'm not affiliated with them and I get no benefit from telling you that. But it's BIOBAG, and they will break down into basically water and a little bit of tiny bit of CO2 in even a cold system. And so if anyone experiments and you learn of others, feel free to let me know. I'd love to expand that list, but I haven't gone out and tried all the different brands on the market, but I know for sure that BioBag will break down in a backyard system. And you can find those online, you can buy them directly from that company, and you can, even some grocery stores or co-ops are carrying them now. So that is really the only type of bag that I know of that I would comfortably recommend for a cold compost setting.
Hi, Natasha. Thank you. Can you hear me from here?
Yes.
All right. For the in-person crowd, I can take questions and I'll feed them to Natasha. But really quick, Natasha, I see there's a question in the chat regarding rinsing eggshells. Did you already address that, or is that a question?
No, I haven't addressed that yet. So I don't rinse eggshells. I know some folks do. And I know that if you have a backyard flock, they recommend that you not only rinse them, but you actually like microwave or bake the eggshells before chickens might have access to their own eggshells. I don't have a backyard flock, so that's not my concern. I have never had a problem by not rinsing eggshells, and for me, it's an extra step. Again, that might come down more to personal preference. Some people feel very passionately that needs to happen for their system. It's not going to hurt anything to rinse them. I just choose to not take the time to do it, and it's totally fine from a composting point of view.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any questions here? Let's see. Natasha, do you have any other general tips that you haven't addressed already, or questions that you get often that might be helpful for everyone to hear from?
We've covered a lot of them. I think it's helpful to understand, sort of like what I was just alluding to, that there may be, or that it's helpful within your, because we're talking about home composting, I'll just say within your household, different household members may have different ick factor levels. And by that, I mean, it might be more important for them to, like, they'll put the food scraps in there, but it's really gross for them to empty the food scrap bucket themselves, or like the eggshell thing. Some people may just have certain preferences. And so having a conversation about that and being clear about who's doing what and what can go into a compost, so everyone contributing understands what is accepted and what isn't, is helpful. And especially I see this around those fruit stickers, those PLU stickers that we've already talked a little bit about. Those are plastic. They should be taken off. They will not break down in a compost system. And so there are all kinds of tools, especially with kids, that work, but I find actually people of all ages like fun little things. And so we have on our website, and I can certainly share with this group if you want to send it out, like little templates like of like a chicken, and it says something about like put your, keep your fruit stickers out of your compost. And then it's like tacked to the fridge or somewhere near where your kitchen caddy is. And it's just a reminder, and then you can peel them off and sort of make art with the, or fill up the chicken feathers with different colored PLU stickers, those produce stickers. So just making sure everyone's on board and they know what system you have. And if the person who always empties the kitchen caddy is sick or goes away, make sure that someone else in your place is going to be emptying it for you. So those kinds of things. It gets more complicated at the community scale, but I've seen a lot of miscommunication around food scrap composting, even at the household scale. Or they might take the food scrap bin out, but then get distracted and forget about it and leave it out there. And an animal will certainly come and tip over a easily accessible food scrap bin that's just left out there open or available. Or they might be tipping it into your system, but not knowing that they need to add carbon. So just making sure that everybody is on the same page can be really helpful and can actually limit potential, animal concerns in particular, or just stinky, smelly concerns.
Thank you.
I have a problem with fruit flies.
All right.
I don't know. Fruit flies,
How do you address fruit flies?
yeah.
That is a big concern with this group. So I'll address it again, but if this is being recorded, so if you're listening to the recording, this may be redundant. So fruit flies, there are different ways of addressing them. At the source is always what I recommend first. So you can get one of those little fruit net tent things that sit over a fruit bowl that can help keep the population down. You can also put apple cider vinegar and water and a couple drops of dish soap into a little bowl or jar and set that near there, and it attracts the fruit flies in, and then they get trapped. So you're reducing the population that you're potentially concerned about. And then rinsing your collection bucket, your kitchen caddy, with a white vinegar water rinse, especially if you've just had an outbreak of fruit flies, that's a natural way of making sure that they won't be living and hatching inside your kitchen caddy as well. And then from the compost bin or tumbler side, making sure that you're really covering those food scraps that might have fruit flies in them with a good amount of carbon. And sometimes people will call me and they've opened up their bin and all these flies come out. That's kind of gross for some people. It's certainly not ideal. It doesn't hurt, the compost isn't then contaminated, so there's no concerns there. But you then might want to like make sure that you're got a pitchfork or something in there and you're just kind of like fluffing it and making sure that carbon is really well integrated into your system. Or just top it with more wood shavings or carbon can also help. Some folks swear by, if they have a lot of fruit flies in their compost bin, they'll flatten a cardboard box and wet it and put it on top. And they swear that helps bring it down. I haven't personally experimented with that, so I can't attest to that, but those are some ideas to address fruit flies. And some fruits have more fruit fly, like melons and citrus will tend to be, or bananas will have more fruit flies than say apples. So, yeah.
Right, sure. And the green?
So I started just a few weeks ago with some small little bins built like 1 foot square, 2 foot square. And when I took the lid off, it sprouts. Whatever I put in there, it sprouted. How do you keep stuff from sprouting up? You just turn it around and let it decompose.
Did you get that, Natasha?
No, I couldn't
All
hear
right.
that.
We have someone who started a couple of weeks ago and they checked on it and there were sprouts and sprouted up. How do you prevent that from happening?
Yeah, so cold composting does not kill seeds. And that is just part of that. And so So depending on what was sprouting, certainly for garden waste or for veggie gardens or flower gardeners, or if you're pulling weeds and you're putting those in there, you want to get them before they go to seed, or cut the seed heads off and dispose of them separately to limit the amount of seeds that get into your system. But even like tomato seeds or cucumber, like pumpkin seeds, squash seeds will sprout in a cold system. There is no real way to prevent that. I've actually, in my own cold system at home, you know, I've had a potato growing, a sweet potato was just starting off. You can turn it under and break it up. It will, you know, die and break down again. But some of the things to think about are using your finished compost in a place that you're okay with volunteer tomatoes or cucumbers growing. A lot of people will use home compost on their yards, on their grass. If you're not a purist about what species are growing and you're just looking for a green yard, you can use it to top dress and reseed, or fill in holes or divots and seed grass right into that. It makes a great medium. It does add to your overall soil health in your yard, and then you're mowing it. And so whatever might go, you know, whatever might sprout really won't get the chance to, you'll just get the green. But cold composting is going to lend itself to things that we call them volunteers kindly. So, or as they sprout, if you've used compost and you're getting a tomato volunteer coming up in the middle of your peonies, pluck it out, pull it out once you know it's a tomato, or once you know it's something that you don't want to grow there.
Grass. Is grass okay in your, as a grass?
Is grass okay as a brown?
So green grass, like fresh grass clippings, are more of a green than a brown. They're not gonna, you know, so it's a little bit depends on if it's dried out or not. It's fine to add to a compost system. I wouldn't add, like you know, I wouldn't exclusively use grass in I mean, in that case, just put it in a pile. Like, it's not gonna, it's not a problem to use, but it's not gonna add a whole lot. The other thing that I'll say, and if you've had like clumps of fresh cut grass that you leave on your lawn, they can kind of get matted and get kind of like a little moldy or hold water. So we're not so concerned about that molding and that being in your compost, but it might create pockets where it's too wet and can get smelly. And so if you are going to use grass, you just want to make sure that it's actually mixed a little bit with other materials, so you don't get that matting effect. But otherwise, it's totally fine to add grass clippings. I guess my one caveat is if you have your lawn treated with any kind of chemicals, then I would keep those grass clippings out. Like if you have a lawn service that comes and sprays herbicides or pesticides, some people are doing more pesticides now on their lawns to keep like mosquito populations down. I would not necessarily integrate that into your home, your backyard system.
Speak about the moisture that you're getting, how moist should your compost be?
Can you speak to how moist your compost should be?
Yeah, so you can even Google, or on the CAP website, there's a little video that shows this technique. So just to have in the back of your mind, it should be like a damp sponge. So if you wetted a sponge and you wrung it out as tightly as you could, that sponge moisture that's left, that's about what you're going for. That'll get you in a good range. If you want to be more engaged in your compost system as opposed to passive in your compost system management, we teach home or backyard composters and community composters what's called a squeeze test. It's essentially just like what I described for the compost. So gloved handed or not, depending on the material. If you're, you know, not necessarily like a fresh tomato, but like what is looking like it's mostly decomposed and there aren't recognizable food scraps in it, you can grab a handful of that material and squeeze it. And if water comes pouring out or trickling out, that's too much moisture. And if you open your hand and it's really dry and falls apart, that's not enough moisture. So your sort of ideal visual is that you might have a little bit of water glistening between your fingers, but it's not really dripping. When you open it, it'll likely hold that ball for a little bit, but might start slowly sort of like falling apart, but not like dry falling apart. Just it might sort of crumble a little bit. That's how, or even maybe just having that visual in your mind will help you get that moisture right.
What about pine needles?
Pine needles are okay. I wouldn't use a ton of pine needles. They take a long time to break down. They're harder for the microbes to decompose, to digest. And so if you use a lot of pine needles, you're just going to end up, one, they're not going to be as effective as a brown. So you'll need more, would need more of them. And you're going to end up with a bunch of pine needles at the end, even once everything else has broken down. But you know, I certainly, if you're raking and you have deciduous leaves as well as pine needles that are on the ground, I wouldn't worry about some getting in. I just wouldn't use that as a primary carbon source, and I wouldn't be adding large volumes of them in.
Any other questions? Yes?
One quick question, does, what is recommended for sifting, if any?
What is recommended for sifting, if any?
So
Do you sift?
do I sift? Here's my dirty secret. I sift my compost when I'm going to bring it to show at a workshop or if I'm tabling. So I don't personally sift the compost that I use. You can, it depends a little bit on what is left in your compost. If you've used sort of like wood chips or chunks that are larger, they're going to take longer to break down. If you're using that type of woody material, I wouldn't recommend that you use more than 10% of your overall system be those, because they're just gonna, those you would need to sift out at the end. I worked with one group, I was just telling this story the other day, who they ate more avocados collectively. It was a community group. So they ate more avocados collectively than I've ever seen in a system. Like every shovelful had like 4 or 5 avocado pits in it. It was amazing. And so then you know, you can pick them out or not, and you can, you know, they will continue breaking down. Anything that you do that's organic that hasn't broken down that you do pick out or sift out, you can just put it right back in your system. It will break down more slowly over time. If you do want to sift, sometimes if you're using it on your lawn, it's easier to have the finer materials to sort of like as a top dressing to sort of get into the lawn itself as opposed to sitting on top. You can either make or buy just screens that sit over like a wheelbarrow and sort of just pitchfork or shovel your finished compost onto that. And what falls through the wheelbarrow, well, you can do 1/8 inch or 1/4 inch, you know, will be fine. And then those are technically called the overs, the things that don't fall through your screen. Those can go back in or be used more as like a top dressing mulch somewhere, as long as it is finished compost. But just larger particle sizes. But it's really up to you and the time that you want to spend and the application that you're using it for.
Thank you. I do know we're about at time. Are there any last questions before we head out? All right, any last notes?
Yeah, no, thank you. Good luck, everybody. I hope that you all feel at least enough confidence to start your system if you haven't already. And I just encourage you to keep reaching out with the folks in the room that you have there as experts. We have a lot of resources on our website. There's a lot of resources just available in general online now, and YouTube videos and all kinds of things about everything you could possibly think of.